This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews, or news, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue. And guess what? Now you can call them on your auto insurance too with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. It works just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you the coverage options that fit your budget. Get your quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hey there, How To listeners. Before we start the show, I want to let you know about a story coming up a little later. It's from one of our partners, SAP. AI comes at you fast. If you don't get reliable and relevant advice, your business might miss out. Whether you're looking to automate tasks or embed AI in your business processes, SAP can help. To learn more, head to sap.com/AI and stick around for expert advice on how to embrace AI with confidence.
I am a 60-year-old heterosexual single male that is a frequent, if unsuccessful, user of dating apps. And 30 years ago, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, better known as MS. How should I relay this critical information when dating?
Welcome to How To, the show where listeners give us their trickiest questions and we find the perfect people to give them guidance. I'm Carvell Wallace. This week's listener, Todd, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis about 30 years ago. MS is a chronic disease where the immune system attacks itself, and the way it presents is unpredictable.
You may see someone in a wheelchair, you may see someone snowboarding. They may both have MS, and you'll never know it.
For the first decade of the disease, Todd wasn't experiencing symptoms, which meant that people weren't really treating him differently. And perhaps more importantly, he wasn't thinking of himself differently. He could still do all the physical things that he took for granted. But as the years have gone by, that has changed, and things have gotten progressively worse. Now, some days Todd walks with a limp. Some days he uses a mobility device like a cane, and sometimes his symptoms aren't visible at all. And that is what leads us to his current predicament.
I am never married and have been a frequent user of dating apps since they all ask for a very profile. I continually come across the question, at what point do I reveal my disability? Do I do it in the profile? Or will that cause issues with people just swiping left right off the bat? Or do I wait until they meet face to face? And then do they either detect that I've got a limp? And then do I make them an excuse for the limp? Or do I just come out and say I have MS?
Let's talk a little bit about what you've tried in the past. I mean, you've laid out a number of different options. Which of these methods have you tried and what have been the results?
Well, I've tried them all, but my first instinct was not to worry about it at all. And granted, for most people, MS is a progressive disease. So in the early days of online dating, you couldn't tell. And as the disease has progressed and my symptoms have become more visible, I wasn't sure that was the right approach.
You see, symptoms don't wait to present at opportune times. Sometimes they can pop up uninvited and force your hand, and you can find yourself having an intimate conversation with a potential partner before you really want to.
I had connected with somebody and we had met and dated a couple of times. And, the other part of this, which may not be family friendly, but MS can sometimes affect your quote unquote performance when it comes to intimate situations. And so as things progressed to that point, I panicked a bit, said, hey, by the way, I have MS, as if that's making an excuse of some sort. And I didn't say it in the most appropriate of circumstances.
It's an experience Todd didn't want to repeat. But putting MS in his profile, which would seem the obvious solution, raises a whole new set of questions. What exactly do you say, and how do you say it?
The latest sort of iteration of my MS reveal is I'm contemplating putting in my profile, sometimes I use a cane. And that is descriptive, and certainly I don't think implies anything too serious, but at least prepares them for they're not going to get, Charles Adler.
Well, let me ask you a question about that. you feel like if some people might just swipe left immediately upon seeing MS or reject or whatever the sort of no version is on whatever site you're on. I guess my question is like, well, if they're the kind of person that sees MS and says no, doesn't that mean that they're not the kind of person who could have a working relationship with you, a person who has MS?
It's true. I mean, in some cases, if someone's going to make that kind of snap decision based on MS, then yeah, that probably wouldn't work out anyway. However, I mean, it's sort of like Jim Carrey when he says to Lauren Holly, so you're saying I have a chance. There's always a chance that someone just doesn't understand. And once they understand, then, I don't want to sort of miss the opportunity. So it becomes very complicated. And it's just, that's what prompted the inquiry to your show, because I thought, how would you guys deal with it?
How and when to disclose a personal and sometimes invisible thing about your body to a potential dating partner is actually a very complicated problem. It brings up issues of fear, insecurity, changes in your sense of self, and worst of all, many people find themselves trying to figure out how to navigate it alone. But not today. Todd no longer has to face this situation alone, and neither do you.
We get a lot of messages, intended or not, that being disabled means that romantic attachment is not a world that we are a part of. And I can't stress highly enough that that's just simply not true. There are millions of disabled people who are happily dating, happily partnered, having sex, all of those things. And if it's a world that you want to be a part of, you have every right to throw your hat in that ring. And welcome to the club.
That's Caroline Cupp, faith leader, a mom, and an author who writes about disability and relationships.
Todd, I just wanted to say that your experience came up a lot when we were working on the book, and in the interviews we've done since, it is by far the most common question.
And that's Jessica Slice, an author who focuses on disability, especially when it comes to dating and parenting. Jessica and Caroline have just written a new book called Dateable: Swiping Right, Hooking Up, and Settling Down While Chronically Ill and Disabled. It's nuanced, it's funny, and it's based on their own experiences and the experiences of dozens of other people with disabilities. Actually, on that note, there is a debate about whether to use disabled person or person with disability. Both Caroline and Jessica prefer disabled person, and Todd is agnostic. So that's how we'll operate for the rest of the episode. Okay. When we return from break, we're going to dig into how to navigate disclosure, ableism, and internal expectations when dating. Stay with us. When you hear a good idea, it's natural to do a double take. Well, that's what you might do when you hear Discover will automatically double the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. Wait, what? Yep, double the cash back is something so good you might do a triple take. Get rewarded no matter who you are or how much you spend with Discover. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
This podcast is brought to you by Slate Studios and SAP. AI is moving so fast. If you don't get reliable and relevant advice, your business might miss out. Welcome to Dear Artie, an advice column from SAP, where we tackle the tricky questions at the intersection of AI and business. Here's our expert, the technology futurist, Ian Kahn.
Hi, I'm excited to dive into today's question.
Dear Artie, as our company expands, so do our hiring efforts. How can AI help us attract top talent? Signed, Searching for Higher Power.
So, Searching for Higher Power, one of the most daunting undertakings of an HR leader today is building a new team and finding and vetting new talent. This is a very time-consuming process and can take precious organizational resources. As a companion to the HR team, AI technology can be used to create job descriptions, analyze candidate resumes, and filter candidates into various pools based on experience, skills, or any other parameter. You can also use AI to match internal talent with positions available. Parameters for this can be set, rules can be set, that can all be done through the algorithm. There are so many things that we as humans could be not looking at that AI can do in a matter of seconds.
Embrace AI with confidence. Head to sap.com/AI to learn more.
Jessica Slice's disability first presented when she was 28 years old and hiking in Greece. She has a latent genetic condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or EDS, which affects her mobility and energy. The appearance of her symptoms ended her 12-year relationship, and she found herself single and dating with a disability at 30. So naturally, she too was mulling over a lot of the same decisions that Todd is facing.
Todd, I just wanted to say that I really appreciated where you said you want to give your dates a chance. I didn't disclose my disability on the apps. And while writing the book, I asked my husband if I had, would you have matched with me? And he said, honestly, no. He knew so little about disability. He would have been operating entirely on assumptions. I told him on our second date, and I could tell at that point he was totally committed to me. And he said once he knew me and started to learn about what it meant to be disabled, he had no trouble staying. And he now looks back with some shame and regret on that earlier version of himself. I guess all that to say, I think what's so tricky about this question is, there's first, like, how do we come to terms with our own body and our own either shame about that body or acceptance of it or love of it or pride or whatever it is? How do we come to terms with that? One, but then two, we're putting out this like facsimile version of ourselves. It's such a one-dimensional app-based self into the world, into like a highly ableist and anti-disability world. And so, yes, we want to put our full self out, but we're also not putting ourselves out into a perfect space. Apps aren't wonderful systems. And so what do we put out, and when do we tell someone to give them the best chance to be the best version of themselves and to give us the best chance to be seen as who we are? And I think it's possible to ask that question without being ashamed of your disability or who you are. I think you can ask that question just with the acknowledgement of how the world is.
Caroline Cupp also met her partner online, but she took the opposite approach from Jessica.
I disclosed a lot. So I was like, well, Caroline, I walk with crutches. I did all, and I was like, I'm going to put in every single thing that would make somebody like decline. But I also did the opposite and put some really specific things about things that I wanted for people. And it was both terrifying because I was like fully expecting to show up to absolutely no matches. But the other thing that I realized was how much energy it was taking me personally to decide what to disclose, to decide how to present myself, to decide what I thought another person could tolerate, to decide, like, I was making all of these decisions about perception. And when, for at least this moment, it's not that I'll never do that, but for at least this moment, I'm going to stop taking away those decisions and I'm just going to be who I am out in the world. It was so freeing and kind of fun to sort of trust myself, to trust the world a little bit more, that when people did say, yeah, I'd be interested, I was kind of delighted and surprised. I was like, oh my gosh, okay, buckle up. Let's see how this goes. I will say that when I did meet my husband, that we had this great first date, and I was again kind of like, oh my gosh, this guy sort of saw all of these things that I put out and was still interested. But it took him a while to call me back. And when we talked about it later, and I said, hey, that was like 4 days. You had me kind of scared. He said, I was thinking honestly about what a life with you would look like. He also has CP. It's a little bit less severe than mine is. And he's like, how did two disabled people make their way in the world? Like, what is this going to impact? But I think that having that out on the table and being able to say like, hey, this is real life. Yeah, it may not be fun and bubbly and sexy and all of those things, but it's also true and real. There's something really intoxicating about that.
Well, I'm wondering also in that I don't want to connect with somebody who is looking to be my caretaker, who wants to be my savior necessarily.
Has that come up for you in the past? Because I mean, my first thought is that usually that sort of caregiver role doesn't develop off the bat. It takes, establishing relationship patterns to fall into that. Have you found that it comes up earlier for you?
I haven't. And I may be projecting a bit because my mom is so, I don't want to say guilt-ridden, but I think she feels like part of this is her fault and she wants to take very good care of me. But I think also when I was first diagnosed and I'd been seeing a woman for years, I broke up with her, but in the breakup, she said, hey, I would have been there to help you out. And at that point, I felt like I don't want to be an object of someone's, I don't want to say pity, but special care, I guess. And that's perhaps stayed with me for too long.
Well, I mean, I wonder about abandoning it and then also considering the role of caregiving, mutual caregiving in a relationship. This is something my husband and I talk a lot about. I think there's an assumption, since I'm a wheelchair user and physically disabled, that he takes care of me. And in many ways he does, but also in many ways I take care of him. He's the first to say that if anything, it's even or weighted into like I'm taking care of him more. And I would imagine in any relationship you've had that you have provided a great deal of care to your partner, and there may be specific ways that they care for you. But I do think that's a dynamic in every relationship, disabled and not. And there is some, there's tricky bits with power and safety, but I don't think taking care of one another is like on its face uneven or disability specific.
Jessica and Caroline are right. Taking care of each other isn't disability specific, but those power dynamics and safety concerns are real. Disabled people sometimes experience people projecting an entire role onto them just because of one aspect of your humanity. Then there are people who will say, I want to be with you because I think you can't get anyone else. Essentially, you're the safe bet for me, which is, in my opinion, even scarier. And then there's internalized societal expectations that create doubts and maybe even make us settle for some of these unhealthy relationships.
There is always the idea that the male counterpart will always be the one who is the protector and the provider. And if I can't meet those roles as society might expect, then I feel diminished.
Well, I'm curious, Todd, if you said society has that expectation. I'm curious to what extent you have that expectation of men and of yourself.
I've heard this term anticipated history.
Oh, that's good.
So my anticipated history was that I would, become this 80-year-old guy who was running marathons and sailing boats, and I could always chase down the mugger who is trying to steal my wife's purse or whatever the case was. And in fact, even when I watch movies now and I say, boy, I could never do what these people do because I'm just not, I can't. I often quote Clint Eastwood from Dirty Harry when he says a man's got to know his limitations. And I've become very aware of the fact that I have distinct limitations I have to cope with.
Jessica and Caroline, this sounds so much to me and you can tell me if this is true in your research, like an experience that's specific to someone whose disability has grown and emerged later in life rather than someone who has had it their entire life. Does that sound accurate to you? And have you seen different reactions to this question of adjusting one's internal expectations for people who are born with a disability versus people who develop one in life?
So this is Jessica, and I became disabled at 28, and Caroline was born with a disability. And I think one difference we've noticed, personally, but then also in our interviews and research, is that for some people who become disabled later in life, we retain some of the earlier entitlement of not being disabled. That I think when I was dating, I had sort of outsized confidence because I had all this carryover confidence from before the world looked at me as a disabled person. And I was repeatedly shocked and outraged by treatment, where Caroline had it, and I'll let her speak to this, but had a different experience and went into dating with a little more pessimism. But to what you said, I do think there is a period of adjustment. For me, realizing I would be disabled for the rest of my life, there was a long period of grief. And then really it was through reading, and in my case, this was powerful, reading the works of disabled philosophers and really getting into disability theory, that I was able to accept and embrace my new experience of my body. That's not available to everyone and not even wanted by everyone, but that was my experience, that after a couple years, I was able to really like the disabled version of myself, in fact, better than the version of me that didn't have a disability. I like who I've become and feel really proud of that version.
Listen, grief is good. Grief works, okay? It's perfectly okay and even natural to grieve what Todd calls the anticipated history. You had a whole idea about who you'd be and how it would all work, and you have just recently learned that it's not happening, at least not the way you assumed. That is something to take time with. But there's also something else that happens in there. Fear. And maybe even anger, driven by the internalized assumptions about how our value as people and humans will change if we are disabled, and more importantly, if we are perceived as disabled.
What I think it is important to do is to think about it as not the only narrative. And some of why we started this research in the first place and came to it was because there's such a lack of conversation broadly and lack of images for what healthy, interdependent, mutually supportive, disabled or interabled relationships look like. And so when we don't have a lot of exposure to what it looks like when two people with disabilities are just married and they're going to the grocery store, or they're dating and going out, or they're meeting people, or they're having first intimate encounters, or whatever it might be, even though that stuff is happening, we don't talk about it, we don't see it. And then the images that we do see around disability, or the things that we fear or we feel, take up a lot of space. And what you're saying, Todd, just to like support the fact that this is not, I remember talking to one guy who is about the same age as you, sort of a lot of similarities. And he said when he would go out with women and say, hey, I'm disabled, for a variety of reasons, my income is pretty low because of that. He felt like he could see just a veil pop over. And what he thought he was seeing was all the things that he would never be able to give them or do for them. And that was he was just like so discouraged. And then at the same time, we've also and experienced people saying like, oh, I want to be with you because I think you can't get anybody else. And for that reason, you're a safe bet for me. And that's not only unsavory, but also scary. And what I'm saying is there's not only a third way, but there's like an 80th way.
Right.
And listen, there are other factors that come into play. I mean, I sometimes, and this is going to sound really bizarre, but there are times where I think it would just be easier if I lost both my legs in a car crash, because then you could see, boom, boy, he had a car crash. What an unfortunate situation. But in the image I present with MS is sometimes I'll look fine and I don't feel fine. And sometimes I get angry because of my situation. And that makes me less, I think of myself as a pretty optimistic guy, but there's a part of me that seems to emerge when I'm having a particularly difficult day that I'm not proud of, but is sort of part and parcel of having a disease like MS.
Coming up, we're going to talk about the role of ableism and the intimacy of depending on others and even sex. Don't go anywhere. This episode is brought to you by Defender. For those who embrace the impossible, the Defender 110 is up for the adventure. This iconic vehicle has been redefined with thoroughly modern design. The exterior is reimagined with compelling proportions and precise detailing, and the interior is built with robust materials and integrity. The Defender capability is legendary, whether you're facing off-road challenges or harsh weather conditions. Built for the modern explorer, the Defender 110 lets you go further and do more. And cargo capacity means more room for your gear. To drive the Defender is to explore with greater confidence. Powerful innovations like the intuitive driver display and award-winning infotainment system keep you connected. Innovative camera technologies deliver unobstructed views and effortless maneuvering. Ready for a wide range of adventures, the Defender family features the two-door Defender 90, the Defender 110, and the Defender 130, which seats up to 8. A vehicle made to go further. The Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender. When you hear a good idea, it's natural to do a double take. Well, that's what you might do when you hear Discover will automatically double the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. Wait, what? Yep, double the cash back is something so good you might do a triple take. Get rewarded no matter who you are or how much you spend with Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
First, the bad news. SAP Business AI won't help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, and automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations, so you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
We're back with our listener Todd and Jessica Slice and Caroline Cupp, the authors of Dateable, which is actually a book they never planned on writing.
We actually got there by accident. We were writing a series of children's books together, Jessica and I. And in the course of writing this, we would talk about, we would talk about our kids and we talk about life and we talk about going to Costco. And we were like, remember when we were interesting? Like, remember when we used to like go out at night and we would meet people and it wasn't all about, peanut butter and jelly. And so that sort of joke was, we remember when we were dating with disabilities. And one day we're like, oh man, that's the book that we should write. Is like, what is it like to date with disabilities? And we thought, well, somebody's written it before. And it turned out no one had written it before, which was kind of a shock. And so that drove us to this idea of like, let's interview dozens of different people about their lives and their romantic relationships. And now all I want to do is talk to disabled people about our love lives because it's unendingly fascinating and people are hysterical and funny. But I think it also was so incredibly gratifying because prior to listening to all of these stories, I didn't realize how deeply alone I felt that this experience. And I think one of the things as disabled people that we even have to, like maybe the first hurdle is even thinking that we belong in this dating world at all. And for so long, I think I felt like an imposter. Is it okay as a disabled person? Am I allowed to want to date? Am I allowed to want to be in a relationship? And is this world even for me? And part of ableism is that idea of maybe it's not, maybe we're not allowed to be in that world.
I think that's a new concept for a lot of people. And I think it's one of those concepts that actually ties almost everything together. And I also think it has a huge impact on the way that we view ourselves, those of us that have any kind of limitation or disability. Can you talk a little bit about how the sort of newcomer to this concept can understand ableism 101?
Ableism is essentially the idea that certain bodies and certain types of thinking and being in an embodied person are better than other ways. And there are ways that put those bodies like ours, outside of the mainstream. We might have different tools that we need to do things like transport, move, walk, communicate, things like that. But really, the work against ableism is saying that all bodies have needs. And the way that many of our systems set up only offers those tools to a very narrow group of people.
I would imagine that if I felt like it were better not to be disabled, than to be disabled, if I had it deeply internalized that belief because it had been taught to me in every way, shape, and form, implicitly, sometimes explicitly throughout my entire life, that when I became disabled, it would then be very hard for me to go out and date and be in the world because I would feel like I was less than I used to be, A, and B, less than I'm supposed to be. And then I would be encountering people who also believed that. So when they found out that I was disabled, they would then start treating me like I was less than I'm supposed to be. And this would then reinforce this internalized idea, and it would make the whole affair quite difficult for me.
It's interesting because I know that even when I'm just out and about and I see couples walking swiftly down the street, I go, boy, walking that fast, those days are behind me now. And you sort of have to just accept that there's a different way that time unfolds when you are disabled. And part of it is also you don't want, I made some money doing, manual labor. And so some of those options are no longer available to me. And all of a sudden you become, on the dole, as it were. But you don't want to be Blanche Dubois and depend on the kindness of strangers. But you kind of do because, for a long time, I eschewed the idea of having a handicap placard. And now I embrace it. But that was a big step for me, as is using a cane. I rarely use a cane, although I probably should do more of it. It's just sort of altering or adjusting your lifestyle and expectations to reflect the fact that you've now got this. And it's nothing I did, nothing anybody did to me. It's just life. And it frustrates me when people say, oh, you're 60, I'm 60. That's just getting old. And I want to grab them by the collar and say, this is not just getting old. I know what getting old is supposed to be like. This is much worse than that.
Yes, all of that makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to talk about something that I learned when writing the book, which I didn't expect going into it. Disabled people, or at least some of the people we interviewed for the book, were some of the most creative people I have ever talked to, both, in how they go about their days, but then also how they structured relationships, and then also how they handled their sexual connections. And I know you had mentioned that earlier. And I do want to say that there are a lot of disabled people talking very openly about their sex lives, and I interview some of them in the book. Mm-hmm. And a lot of disabled people have very interesting, creative, adventurous, and in their own words, like phenomenal sex lives that are maybe not traditional. And breaking free of traditional definitions of sex has really been freeing to a lot of the disabled people we talk to. And I personally found that incredibly moving.
From my perspective, there are times where I would just love to talk about the realities of having sex when you're disabled. and how you deal with and cope with it. But it is a taboo topic, at least perceived taboo. And I think you're right on in that we should just have some way to talk more openly about that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with that. And I don't mean this as a plug, but there are 2 chapters in the book that deal kind of as explicitly as you might want with disabled people having sex and talking about supplies and positions and experiences. And I feel so grateful for the people who we interviewed who were like, ask me anything. I'll tell you anything because I'm proud of this part of my life.
Are there diagrams? If it's illustrated, I'm buying.
There are links. There are links to diagrams. You know, Caroline
and I
find
visual aids for sure.
Yeah, Caroline and I joke like we're picture book writers who also have a list of disability sex toys in one of our books. So
yeah,
the classic combo.
But it does strike me that so much of this is like, I mean, Todd, when you said to talk about sexuality among disabled people is taboo, it made me think of, well, that depends on where you are, right? It depends on what rooms you're in. And it feels to me like because we live in a world that is largely ableist, that yes, if you are operating in kind of like mainstream spaces, then it is this bizarre taboo. But there are other spaces that are created by disabled people who are like, I would like to enjoy my life and have good sex, please. And in those spaces, people are talking about disabled sex very openly, and there's very little taboo around it. And part of your experience is that you now have a reason to move into different spaces.
I like that, Carvell.
Well, bodies change. I mean, if we are fortunate enough to live long enough and have companions and friends and partners and everything who are also living long, that in the course of that, our bodies will change. And who we are today is different than who we are tomorrow. As disabled people, we have a sort of intimate knowledge of it. It's not that we necessarily expect it or welcome it, but we're also connected to it and not running from that. There are times when I am more dependent on others than I would like to be. Like, oh my gosh, you person who I barely know, I am needing to get up this top step. Can I just hold on to your hand for a second? Very intimate gesture for a near stranger. But that vulnerability, that ability to connect and to acknowledge the shifting things, that actually, those are huge resources to bring into a partnership, especially one in your 60s where you're with people who have lived, they're mature, they've been around the block. And so I think seeing your disability in that way and your experiences as an asset is one of the things that you bring to the table, not just something that separates you from that table.
All of that does bring me to our initial question, which is that given all this, what is your advice to Todd about when and how to disclose and talk about his disability in the space of dating?
There's not one right answer, but one way that I think you can get to your right answer is think about what you'd hope for your potential dates to disclose to you. So if you're somebody that likes to have a lot of things out in the open and you don't like surprises, then I would say err on the side of not surprising them. If you're a person that likes to cultivate a little bit of mystery and throw some breadcrumbs and you respond well to that when it's somebody else does it, then I think throw those breadcrumbs and see where you land. I do wonder, with sharing a diagnosis on a dating website, which is already just, so fraught, it can, I think, have the impact of that person has maybe they've met one person with MS, maybe they've met one person with CP or spina bifida. So when they hear that diagnosis, they may have all of those people sort of in their heads. But the reality is, as you've said, you've met one person with CP, you've met one person. How all of these disabilities show up is so varied. And so rather than lead with a diagnosis, I think there is value in leading with how that diagnosis presents for you. I use a cane. I sometimes use a wheelchair. And then that person is both not surprised, but they also don't have a whole body of images that they're bringing with them into that swipe.
I want to just give the one piece of advice that Darcy Neal, who is an incredible disabled person who spoke so openly for the book, And what they offer is that they put on their profile, match with me if you're open-minded. And then when they are chatting and they say they have cerebral palsy, then this person has a lot of pressure on them to be open-minded because they've already committed to it.
That's so funny.
And I sort of love that. I mean, I know Caroline might say just be totally open. In my case, I wouldn't have met my husband, so I don't think there's a right answer. But I think Darcy may also be on the right track.
Remember when Jessica said her husband wouldn't be with her if she was upfront about her disability? Well, the story is actually a little more complicated than that, and I think it's worth ending on. So here's Jessica again.
So as I was writing the chapter on apps, I started to, feel like maybe I had tricked him into being with me, or that it compromised the goodness of our relationship, that I hadn't disclosed it. And so I emailed him while working on this chapter, and I said, how do you feel when you think about the fact that if I had been honest, we never would have met? And then I worried about what he would say, and he didn't write back right away. And then I waited a little longer, and then I ran into him in the kitchen, and I said, so do you wish you had waited for someone else? Do you feel like I tricked you by not disclosing my disability? And then later that day, I got an email from him, and it said, I don't wish I had waited for someone else. I love you. There are things about your disability that make life difficult, yes. Things that I wish could be easier. For example, I wish we could travel together, go to Italy, no big deal. But I would rather not travel with you than travel with somebody else. You are beautiful and funny and wise and kind and relentless. I have learned a ton from you, and we laugh all the time, and we are compatible. You take care of me in ways that only you have and only you could. I talk with you more freely and more easily than I ever have with anyone else. Why would I wait for someone who can go to Italy but lacks all your wonderful qualities? Now that I love you and I'm married to you, it seems very weird to me that disability is so othering. Before you get to know someone, when you're in dating mode or worse, swiping mode, you, or at least I, tend to think someone is perfect. But what you really mean when you think that is that they will add exactly what you want to your life and hardly change you at all. Of course, that's ridiculous. Everyone is a person. Everyone needs things. Everyone is annoying sometimes. Everyone is mean sometimes. Everyone has health problems. Everyone needs to be driven to the hospital. Everyone changes you. Everyone makes you grow. Being married to a disabled person is being married to a person. Maybe you know about their health condition up front. That's the main difference. The perfect person has health conditions too, or if they don't, they will. Disabled people have needs. Non-disabled people have needs. Disabled people can be annoying. Non-disabled people can be annoying. Living with and loving someone presents them to you under a microscope at a zoomed-in resolution that is unlike anything you can conceive of while swiping. Loving you is loving a person. Your disability dictates some of how our abstract life gets concretized, but it is not a different thing.
I have dreams and aspirations of meeting someone that I can talk to like that. So it's encouraging and frankly gives me hope.
Oh, I'm so glad.
So here's the thing about disability. It includes all of us. You, right now, no matter what your body is doing or not doing, how it is or isn't quote unquote working, you are either in some way dealing with a limited ability or you will be soon. That is one of the reasons why ableism is so important to understand and dismantle. Because a world in which we recognize and care for one another's disabilities is a world in which more of us, a lot more of us, are happier, safer, and freer. And yeah, that includes you. I want to sincerely thank Todd for bringing us this question and for sharing his story with us, and Caroline Cupp and Jessica Slice for their care, guidance, and expertise. Please pick up their book, Dateable. It is really excellent, and there's so much advice that we didn't even get to. And check out the link in our show notes. Do you have a problem that needs solving? Send us a note at howto@slate.com or leave us a voicemail at 646-495-4001, and we might have you on the show. And if you like what you heard today, please give us a rating and a review and tell a friend. That helps us help more people. How To is produced by Rosemary Belson with Kevin Bendis and Sara McCrae. Joel Meyer is senior editor and Derek John is executive producer. Merritt Jacob is our senior technical director and composed our theme music. Charles Duhigg created the show. Courtney Martin is my co-host, and I'm Carvell Wallace. Thanks for listening.